Well, thank you very much, Magnus, for the introduction. And I think in the end it's also a pleasure for me to present something. Originally I thought I would rather step back, but well, it happened like this, and now it's fine to present a rather new considerations on this question, which is a very fundamental question, of course, and I certainly won't give an exhaustive answer to this question. Delusion is a possibility of man without which he wouldn't be what he is a quotation by Henri Maldiney, which might give a first hint on what I'm up to. There are certainly numerous factors and conditions which could be listed as causes of mental illness. Think of genetic, neurobiological factors or personality factors, unconscious drive conflicts, detrimental childhood conditions, adverse social conditions, and the like. But I will address this question in another way, namely from the perspective of philosophical and psychiatric anthropology. Then we do not ask for single causes of specific disorders, but more fundamentally for the conditions of possibility that humans may become mentally ill at all. In other words, what characteristics of their psychophysical constitution are responsible for making them so obviously vulnerable to mental disorders. The fact that lasting mental disturbances are not found in wildlife animals points to an anthropological vulnerability, a specific endangerment of the human being. Even if there are reactions to defeat or social exclusion in higher mammals, such as withdrawal or lethargy, such states usually last only for a few days. Psychoses, compulsions, hallucinations, or delusions do not occur in animals. And last not least, the possibility of suicide is only given to human beings, for in order to decide against one's life, one has to have a relation to it, to one's life, to view it and evaluate it as a whole, which is obviously not possible for animals, for even in hopeless situations, no animal ends its life. And this is a first evidence that for the assumption that the possibility of mental illness is somehow connected to the higher degrees of freedom in the psychophysical organization of humans. In the words of Karl Jaspers, for man, his uncompleteness, his openness, his freedom, and interminable possibility itself become the cause of illness. And I will take this quote as a guideline for my considerations. My question is, to what extent the human condition itself, because of its higher degrees of freedom, displays a lability and fragility which under certain circumstances may lead to excessive demands, to overburdening, to decompensation, and finally to mental illness. So what are the specific conditions of the human life form which entail the possibility of a mental illness? Well, in the first place, there's the lack of instincts and of fixed behavioral schemes, which has already been emphasized by German philosophical anthropology, in particularly by Max Scheler and Arnold Gehlen. The behavioral schemes of animals are far more determined by their genetic makeup and their physical organization. Humans, in contrast, have to gradually acquire their security of behavior. And this is accompanied by the particular openness and freedom of their individual development. Man is, in Nietzsche's words, the non-determined animal, or as the biologist Adolf Portmann put it, a physiological premature infant. His biological endowment is immature at birth. It is only by early socialization, by acquiring patterns of interaction, the upright gait, and finally language, through contact with others, that he becomes human in the full sense. And this is connected to the unique plasticity of the human brain, whose cortex is still undeveloped at birth, And the prefrontal cortex, as the basis of crucial capacities such as perspective taking and moral development, only matures until up to the 25th year of life. So the human brain displays a unique potentiality which it cannot realize by itself, however, but only through cultural socialization. Human behavior is determined to a large extent by cultural schemes and roles which replace the instincts. Culture and the habitus, as the totality of roles and habits which it mediates, culture unburdens human beings from the task to plan each action separately and to create themselves at will, so to speak. But culture, too, leaves humans still incompletely determined. And here lies their individual freedom of choice. Humans do not only live their life, but they lead their lives. And by this, they also form themselves. Through their decisions and actions, they shape their own development. This openness may be interpreted in an optimistic way, such as in Pico de la Mirandola's famous treatise on human dignity, where God says to man, "Thou, constrained by no limits, in accordance with thine own free will, in whose hand we have placed thee, shalt ordain for thyself the limits of thy nature, so that with freedom of choice and with honor, as the maker and molder of thyself, thou mayest fashion thyself in whatever shape thou shalt prefer." But, on the other hand, this openness entails manifold possibilities for disturbances. First of all, a particular disposition to angst, one of the most frequent manifestations of mental disorders. Initially, like in other animals, anxiety functions as a biological warning system which activates the flight or fight reaction of the organism. However, in the course of the development of human culture, this survival-related function of anxiety moves more and more into the background. Instead, anxiety increasingly takes the role of a reaction to social and existential threats, for which the bodily alarm reaction has only limited use. For example, a loss of self-worth or a loss of one's status in the group. Because of their prematurity, humans also are exposed to particular dangers from birth on. Accordingly, Freud saw the primary roots of neurotic anxiety in the long-lasting helplessness and dependency of the little human infant. Anxiety fulfills an important function for the attachment system by indicating the loss of the mother's proximity and thus of the infant's vital security. Similarly, the paleoanthropologist Biltz emphasized the primordial fear of disgregation, from Greg's the herd. So the fear of being separated from the Grecs, from the herd, which was indispensable for survival in a hostile environment. Being abandoned or expelled from the group came equal to a death sentence and caused massive alarm reactions. And today, the fear of being lost in empty space, which is characteristic of panic attacks and agoraphobia, still mirrors their frequent occurrence in situations of separation or loss. Moreover, the development of culture is crucially based on a system of drive controls and refusals which are internalized by the individual. And they are meant to secure the life within the group and to compensate for the lack of instincts. But, as Freud has shown in Civilization and its Discontents, this comes at the price of angst, which is installed as an inner guardian of self-control. And thus also conscience is at its roots social anxiety and nothing else, as Freud declared, and pangs of conscience are a notoriously rich reservoir for neurotic developments. The conflicts between primary egocentric desires and the commandments of society are among the most frequent causes of anxiety disorders and other disturbances. Our disposition to anxiety is further augmented by our capacity of imagination and anticipation of the future, which also enables us to imagine possible dangers, such as diseases, losses, separations, or war. And only for humans, the time perspective extends beyond the immediate future and until the last possibility, indeed, the inevitability of one's death. A fundamental condition of existence whose significance for failing attempts of compensation or for mental disturbances may hardly be overestimated. With the knowledge of death, a field of manifold existential anxieties is opened up, and the concern for one's own life becomes a basic structure of Dasein. The fact that to humans, life is not just given, but also a task and a project, also means a higher, namely an existential endangerment. Human beings can miss their goals and values through their own decisions. Only human life can fail. And therefore, angst is the vertigo of this freedom, to quote Kierkegaard. So angst is the price for the space of freedom, which is in contrast to the necessities of animal life. And it is the price for being conscious of one's own life and aware of one's own death. But this is closely connected to a further basic condition of human existence, which Helmut Plessner has termed the eccentric position. Whereas the animal is bound to its respective environment and always remains in its center, humans are able to step out from the center of their world and take the perspective of an observer of themselves. And that is, to see themselves with others' eyes. This characterizes their eccentric position. And it is achieved with the development of reflective self-consciousness in the second and third year of life. In this period, children become aware of themselves as independent beings. They learn to say I, to distinguish themselves from others, and to develop a relation to themselves. Self-consciousness and reflexivity are certainly crucial for humans and their cultural achievements, but they also come at a price. First, the immediacy and spontaneity of the infant suffers a kind of a break. This manifests itself in self-reflective emotions such as embarrassment, pride, shame, and later on, guilt. Shame and guilt may be regarded as emotions in which the gaze or the voice of the other are bodily felt, as it were, namely as a shaming gaze that I'm exposed to, or as an accusation or condemnation, even if it's a kind of inner voice. The lability of human self-relation and self-worth manifests itself not least in histrionic, narcissistic, or depressive disorders, and also in social phobia. For all these disorders presuppose perspective-taking, self-awareness, self-evaluation from the point of view of the others, in front of whom one's own self may appear either as seductive, as grandiose, as inferior, or also as excluded. Moreover, the human capacity of reflection also bears the seed of an alienation and disturbance. In the excessive ruminations of depressed patients, or in the compulsive thoughts of anancastic patients, thinking becomes independent and turns into an excessive brooding. The patients are unable to find a way out of the tormenting spirals of reflection. And there's a veritable psychopathology of hyperreflexivity, of excessive self-awareness, which may only occur in humans. Take the example of compulsive neurosis. Here, the human capacity of controlling one's drives and impulses becomes independent. The fear of uncontrolled impulses or wishes leads to excessive defense, and that means to manifold compulsive symptoms. That means manifold rituals of self-discipline and control in which life gets more and more stuck. The following example is given by Viktor Frankl. It's a bit a humorous example, but I think it points out what I mean. A 21-year-old perfectionist patient, always top pupil and best in the class, began a career as a bookkeeper. But he soon noticed that his writing was not always legible. When his boss made him aware of this, he tried to improve it and sacrificed all his time to learning to write well. He tried to copy letters from his friend's handwriting, but soon didn't know which letters to use anymore and how he should write. Since he was now completely concentrated on his handwriting, he could no longer write in front of other people, felt observed by them, and finally had to give up his job. In the clinic, it was possible to cure the disorder within 3 weeks with the guideline of the paradoxical instruction, I'll scroll something for that person, for the boss. I'm only writing to scroll, only to get stuck 30 times. So we see here very clearly how hyperreflexivity, so the excessive attention to the bodily inaction, leads to the dissolution of spontaneous writing, reinforced by anxiety and shame in front of the others. So one might say too much consciousness is detrimental. One only sees the details, not the goal and the whole anymore. The compulsive neurotic, however, as soon as he has given up taking his bodily inaction for granted, never gets back to it. For he wants to do everything deliberately and cannot allow anything just to happen. The fear of losing control and letting himself go is too high. The paradoxical therapeutic instruction here allows him to do just this. Once in his life, to be able to just scroll something for his boss. And by this means, the crump of reflection is dissolved. Now, in a but similar way, various forms of depersonalization may be regarded as manifesting the brokenness which characterizes human beings, as beings who, by self-reflection, somehow dissociate from their primary experience. Without doubt, this means a gain in freedom, but on the other hand, the separation from one's own felt sense may take on a tormenting character. The disturbance of self-feeling then permeates all domains of experience, as in the case of a schizophrenic patient of ours, Sanneke and myself. I constantly have to ask myself who I actually am. I think about that so much that I cannot do anything else, as if you were a totally different person all of a sudden. A human being's relation to oneself makes such radical self-doubt possible, and reflection becomes an empty loop. This may finally lead to a disturbance of perspective taking, such that even the border between oneself and the others dissolves, as is also the case in schizophrenia. And in the following case, a schizophrenic patient was frequently confused in a conversation, being unable to distinguish between himself and his interlocutor. He tended to lose the sense of whose thoughts originated in whom, and felt as if the interlocutor somehow invaded him, an experience that shattered his identity and was intensely anxiety-provoking. When walking on the street, he scrupulously avoided glancing at his mirror image in the window panes of the shops because he felt uncertain on which side he actually was. Well, here taking an external perspective on oneself, which is possible only to human beings, taking the perspective of the other, in this case, leads to a loss of the self. For if one's bodily self-awareness has become fragile, as is the case in schizophrenia, then it can no longer be affirmed against the thoughts of others, or even against one's own mirror image. Where am I? Am I here? Am I there? And ultimately, delusion may be the result of such a loss in perspectives. Delusion may be regarded as an excess of perspective taking. That means as a specific failure of the eccentric position. To feel persecuted, to feel manipulated by others is only possible because of a loss, because of a failure of the perspective taking itself. It takes place, but in a wrong way. And this, I think, justifies Maldiney's quotation, which I mentioned at the beginning: delusion is a possibility of man without which he would not be what he is. Finally, only for a human being, one's own naturally lived body becomes the observable corporal body. An instrument or an object that one may shape or handle, but which nevertheless is also the body that one is, and to which there's thus an ambivalent relation. Man is his body, and at the same time, in reflection, is in opposition to his body, as Jaspers put it. Again, this is the presupposition of freedom, for we are able to teach our body, to train our body, to control our bodies. But it also means an ambivalent relation, for we are this body ourselves. And the anxious, hypochondriac observation of one's body, heart phobia, somatization disorder, dysmorphophobia, as well as eating disorders, all have their anthropological foundation in this ambivalent relation to our body. Delivered to its autonomy and contingency, the patients excessively try to control, to dominate, or to manipulate it. For example, the hypochondriac person has lost confidence in his natural bodily processes and seeks in vain to control the reliable performance of his body. By means of his suspicious self-observation, he even reinforces unusual bodily sensations that he then interprets as threatening symptoms. That is how a patient of mine was frightened by a tumor that might cause him to lose his eyesight. He was constantly observing his ability to see and registered his ocular sensations in a tense manner, thus evoking only additional tensions, negative feelings, and tear secretions, although there was certainly no tumor present. And thus his attention was typically directed away from the world and back on himself. So from the seen to the seeing, as it were, or to the eye itself. However, already his loss of confidence in his own body had to do with a reflexively gained knowledge, namely that as a physical human being, one is also prone to illness and mortality. And the more sensitive a hypochondriac is about his physical vulnerability, the more unbearable it is for him. Every banal pain could indicate the possibility of a lethal illness. Hypochondriac neurosis often becomes a lifelong battle against a basic condition of existence that is denied, namely its mortality. And similarly, for the anorectic patients, the body becomes an alienating, even repulsive object. To be in total control of the body, to gain independence from it and from food, becomes the source of a grandiose triumph. I don't feel hungry, I have no desire. For the patient, this means I am self-sufficient and no longer need anything from outside. To give an example, it was as if I had to punish my body. I hated and detested it. If I let it be normal for a few days, then I would have to deprive it again. I felt caught in my body as long as I kept it under rigid control. It could not betray me. Here, the tension between being one's body and having one's body, which is part of the human condition, becomes a radical dichotomy, which is even reminiscent of Platonic or Gnostic ideas of the body as a prison of the soul. And again, we recognize the anthropological brokenness as basis of the illness. No animal would starve its own body, for it only is its body, it doesn't have it. Now we have seen that fundamental conditions of human existence are connected with the lability and contradictoriness, which also entails a vulnerability for mental illness. I now want to complement these considerations with the notion of existential vulnerability, so to speak. It consists, it's so to speak the subjective side of anthropological vulnerability. It consists in a specific sensitivity for the contradictions of human existence, which is found in mentally ill patients. We all live under these basic conditions. We may also suffer from the contradictions, for instance, between autonomy and dependence, between freedom and security, between zest for life and certitude of death. But mentally ill persons suffer from them in a specific way, such that for them, even quite normal and everyday situations of danger, conflict, or loss may become limit situations in the sense of Karl Jaspers. What are limit situations? These are situations in which a hitherto concealed or repressed basic condition of existence comes to light and may no longer be denied. For instance, the unescapability of freedom and decision, the inevitability of separation or guilt, the frailty of one's body, the loneliness of existence, or finally, its inexorable finitude. But mentally ill persons suffer from that in a special way. In each limit situation, says Jaspers, the carpet is drawn from under my feet. Something gets broken, which Jaspers calls the housing, das Gehäuse. Housings are fixed basic assumptions, expectations, attitudes, and worldviews which provide shelter against the contradictions and impositions of life. One could also call them existential defense mechanisms. Such housings frequently include implicit, unquestioned assumptions about life, oneself, or the world. For instance, the following. The world is set in a fundamentally just manner. If I only strive enough and do nothing wrong, this will finally be rewarded. That would be the assumption or defense of the melancholic type. If I subordinate to others, I can count on their shelter and guidance. That would be a dependent defense. If I do everything in a perfect way, life is under my control and I cannot be taken by surprise. Fate cannot harm me. The perfectionist, the anarchistic defense. And if I move up and achieve more and more, I will be invulnerable and death cannot affect me. The narcissistic defense. We see that such basic assumptions often follow the pattern that there cannot happen what may not, what must not happen. So evil, injustice, coincidence, and death may exist, but they cannot affect me. I haven't done anything, I'm innocent, I am special. Different personality structures, dependent, avoidant, anarchistic, narcissistic, are thus characterized by different existential defense mechanisms. A particular housing, for example, is found in the melancholic type, the personality found by Tellenbach to be vulnerable to severe depression. Its characteristic features are rigid orderliness and fulfillment of duties, conscientiousness, avoidance of any guilt, over-adaptation to social norms, clinging to social bonds and commitments to the point of self-denial. However, this rigid housing of assumptions and attitudes finally proves precarious. For if such persons once fall short of their duties, if they experience unjustified rejections or losses of significant bondings, then their world literally collapses. They find themselves in a limit situation, and a severe depression may be the result. I give just one case example. A 58-year-old woman fell ill because she tortured herself with the decision of whether she should sell her house which had become too large for her after the death of her husband. Influenced by advice from friends and family, she in the end sold her house. However, she soon experienced a serious crisis in which she bitterly regretted her decision and finally fell into a deep depression. She then complained relentlessly about her wrong decision. She was convinced that she had suffered an irreparable financial loss and had irreversibly damaged her children. In our further therapy, it came to light that two aspects of her decision were particularly unbearable for the patient. First, its irreversibility, and second, it was the first time that she had made a life-changing decision without her husband, which revealed her unavoidable personal responsibility. As it is typical for the melancholic type, the patient was particularly sensitive to the existential dimension of her decision, namely the irreversibility, the personal responsibility, and the loneliness that was tied up with it. Her housing was literally incorporated in her house and collapsed with its sale. Despite all precautions, the patients cannot escape the burden to lead their lives without a last security. To conclude, anthropological psychiatry seeks an answer to the specific vulnerability of the psychic organization of human beings. What are the conditions of possibility for them to fall mentally ill? I have investigated several possible reasons for this vulnerability. Above all, the particular openness, insecurity, and contradictoriness of the human life form. It starts with its physiological prematurity, which opens the unique space for human cultural and individual development. To the extent of its openness, however, this development is also precarious and endangered. The lack of pre-given instincts and behavioral schemes requires complex learning processes and attunements with the norms, roles, and demands of society. Learning processes which depend on supportive environments and which may also deviate and fail. The eccentric position which the child then acquires in the course of socialization means the peculiar human capacity of perspective-taking, self-consciousness, and reflection. But what makes us human is also what bears the seed of an alienation and self-contradiction, namely between drives and drive control, between lived and object body, between self and others. The alienation may culminate in depersonalization or even in the loss of borders between self and others in schizophrenia. Last not least, the knowledge of finitude and death is a hardly bearable companion to human beings. It requires manifold denials and repressions, but also leads to overcompensation or to avoidances, ultimately to a failing self-realization. The subjective side of anthropological vulnerability is what I've termed existential vulnerability. Mentally ill patients are particularly sensitive to the basic conditions of life and try to protect themselves by a specific housing or a rigid defense structure. Clearly, it is usually not philosophical insights into the human condition which brings about such a defense. Rather, it is fundamental affects, existential feelings, moods that arise from the basic conditions which implicitly confront the patients with the hidden truth of their existence. Angst, feelings of guilt, shame, nausea, emptiness, boredom, or feelings of foreignness and alienation. Existentially vulnerable persons sense the abyssal meaning of these affects and moods more than others and try to banish their existential worries through a housing of precautions and avoidances. But the housing only provides an elusive security. Limit situations lead to its breakdown and confront the persons with the contradictions and impositions of life. And once they may no longer be denied, they become triggers of severe crises or illnesses. On this existential background, Therapeutic approaches will not restrict themselves to contribute to short-term relief and recovery of working ability. Rather, they will use the limit situations as possibilities of leading the patients towards a greater openness for their existential conflicts. They will support the patients in questioning their existential defenses and in finding a new, more self-responsible way of life. I cannot go into the details of such an approach, but it seems to me that a major task of psychiatrists and psychotherapists lies in acquiring an understanding of these basic existential conflicts. Namely, in order to help the patients recognize the existential implications of their crisis, and to help them regarding it not only as a self-caused misfortune, but as a manifestation of the basic human condition, in which we all participate and from which we all suffer. For, to slightly vary a famous quote of Terence, we are all humans and nothing human is alien to us. Thank you very much for your attention.